Welcome back to the Five Quadrants of Portland on XRAY-FM. I'm your host, Jen Chavez. When we talk about criminal justice reform in Portland, as we've been doing this hour, on this day, which happens to be October 1st, it's undeniable that Oregon has a showstopper up its sleeve. That's right, in case you have not heard, Oregon voters have opted to legalize certain amounts of recreational marijuana for consumption and purchase. Figuring out how to regulate changes that officially went into effect this July has been a long process, understandably so. The Oregon Liquor Control Commission, or OLCC, will eventually be taking the reins in regulating the recreational dispensaries yet to come. But legislators voted earlier this year to allow existing medical dispensaries in the meantime to sell marijuana buds, plants, and seeds to recreational customers over the age of 21. Hence the long lines you may have seen passing by one of Portland's many medical dispensaries. Many arguments have been made in favor of ending marijuana prohibition. Why treat marijuana differently than alcohol? Look at its medicinal qualities. Think of all the tax revenue. But the one that's most compelling to me is the role it could play in criminal justice and sentencing reform. The sentence that the U.S. drug war has failed is becoming widespread to the degree that the Pope just said that the drug war, quote, threatens the credibility of our institutions. The facts that our prisons are full to the brim, that drug enforcement and incarceration disproportionately affects people of color and low-income folks, and that private corporations now profit off of prisons and inmates, those facts make a case against the drug policy status quo. In Oregon, the passage of Measure 91 and related legislation addresses marijuana's role in the drug war in our state and comes with broad sentencing and criminal justice reform concerning not only future marijuana use, but also past marijuana offenses and convictions in light of our new laws. Joining me in the studio today to lay out more details about the changes to sentencing and enforcement under Measure 91 is Russ Belville. He is the executive director of the Portland chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML, an organization that's been engaged on this issue for decades. Russ, thanks for joining me today, and welcome to the Five Quadrants of Portland.
It's really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, before we dig into the laws here, I want to kind of ask how you are feeling today as someone who's been fighting for the reforms being put into place for a long time. I know that Measure 91's passage is no longer new, but it seems like the first day that recreational marijuana is available to the public is a milestone. What are your thoughts and reflections today?
Well, I've been a cannabis consumer since July 4th, 1990, so it's been 25 years in the making, and step by step it's just gotten better and better. I'm originally from Idaho, where marijuana is incredibly illegal. Merely having it in your system in public is a crime. So for most of my life, my marijuana purchases were in dark parking lots and back alleys and bars and people's homes that I didn't particularly like. And I knew that the money that I was spending wasn't helping society. It was being made, the profit was being made on the backs of mostly Black and Latino people getting busted, and it wasn't benefiting our tax base in any way. Of course, there was always the ever-present fear of being busted, of being caught, losing your career, your job, losing your freedom even. So that was most of my life, about 17 years of that. I moved to Oregon. My wife became a medical marijuana patient. I first got that taste of being somewhat legal in that I was a medical marijuana caregiver, but that still carried a certain stigma with it, that if you weren't medical, then you were cheating. If you weren't medical, then you're somehow a stoner or a loser or something. And so I still had to maintain, being in the closet and not letting people know about my cannabis-using nature. I've since become an activist, and I've gotten to participate in legal sales in Washington State and in Colorado. But then there's all the expensive travel, and you're not at home, and there's really no place in public to be able to use cannabis. So today, October 1st, 2015, for the first time in my 25 years of being a cannabis consumer, I can buy cannabis in my hometown, take it to my home, use it perfectly legally, and not fear any sort of repercussions from the state in any way. It's a beautiful time to be alive.
Well, I'm glad that you can come in and join us today on X-Ray on this particular day, and thank you for your reflections. So let's look back a little bit before looking ahead. I spoke in the intro about the drug war and mass incarceration. How big of a role have marijuana arrests really played in the U.S. drug war? I think the idea that gets perpetuated about those imprisoned on drug charges is that the majority are there for serious, possibly violent offenses around hard drugs like heroin. But how many are there for, say, marijuana possession? How many are affected by marijuana enforcement in Oregon?
It's a good question because a lot of times our opponents of marijuana legalization will bring up the point that, nobody's really in prison for just possession. It's harder crimes, it's bigger crimes. Well, that may be true. There's not truly a lot of people, maybe a few thousands, maybe 40,000 nationally, that are in prison solely for first-time nonviolent marijuana possession. But the key to this is that marijuana possession, the contraband nature of marijuana, is the first step that unlocks people's civil liberties. More than half of the arrests in the war on drugs are for marijuana. So without those, there aren't enough drug arrests to continue the profit-making in arresting people for drugs. There's so many ways that marijuana consumers being arrested contribute to the fines, to the tickets that were raised here in the state of Oregon. Civil asset forfeiture is another consideration where the smell of weed is used as justification to take people's cars and cash and property. There's just the fact that having illegal marijuana provides a convenient excuse, often called a warrant on a leash, where a canine officer, a drug dog, can either alert to the smell of marijuana, which most of our currency has some sort of drug smell on it, and
Sure.
They can even be trained to false alert or inadvertently alert on the cues of their handler, and that opens up people's private lives to police interference that never would have happened without the smell of marijuana being illegal. So to me, in my perspective, ending the contraband nature of marijuana is the major Jenga block that's going to bring down the war on drugs in general, just because there's not enough people to arrest without it. And the people you do arrest with heroin, cocaine, meth, and so forth, those type of addictions, they cost you money. You put them in prison, they've got medical bills and medical complications you have to deal with, and their addictions make them not the best workers in the world. Cannabis consumers, on the other hand, really good workers, really well-behaved people, and aside from using the cannabis, have very little to do with the criminal underworld. So they're the perfect sort of prisoner, they're the perfect sort of worker in a prison labor situation, they're the perfect sort of graduate of a drug court, because they're not really physically addicted to something. It's easy for them to quit if you threaten them with a P-test, and then the drug court gets these highly inflated stats of how successful they were, because half the people they're treating aren't addicted to anything other than weed in the first place, and it's an easy thing to kick.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. Furthermore, when prison overpopulation and harsh sentencing are criticized, major factors that certain laws disproportionately send people of color to jail. Many refer to a school-to-prison pipeline that is felt especially sorely in African-American communities, but also in other communities of color. What do you know about the racial disparities in enforcement of marijuana laws in our state up until now?
Well, the American Civil Liberties Union did a great report on the war on marijuana in black and white, and they listed it for every state. Nationwide, it was about 4 times greater. Oregon was, I think, close to that ratio. It wasn't an outlier, either in fewer or more arrests proportionally for blacks and Latinos. Our numbers are somewhat skewed by the fact that Oregon is a pretty white state. We don't have a lot of blacks and Latinos compared to, say, California or Illinois. Mm-hmm. But it is still racially disproportionate. And I think one fact I like to bring out in this particular subject is to think about the fact that Oregon's not as bad as other states, but many states in the South and across this country will disenfranchise you if you get a felony. Mm-hmm. And it depends on state to state, but in most of the southern states, you lose your right to vote not only while you're in prison, but also probation, also parole. And in the case of a state like Florida, you lose your right to vote for life for all intents and purposes.
I did not know that.
Now, in the United States, there's 2 states where you never lose your right to vote. That's Vermont and Maine. You can vote as a death row prisoner. You can still vote. States like Oregon, you lose your right to vote while you're in prison, but once you're out on probation or parole, you have your right to vote back. But a lot of people who go to prison don't realize that. And so once they've done some time for weed, they think they can never vote again, even though a lot of them can, and this can affect the elections. If you look back to 2000, we had the Bush v. Gore election. It was highly contested, and it was over the state of Florida, where at the end, George W. Bush was winning, or was thought to have won that state by 537 votes. In the state of Florida, possession of 21 grams or more of marijuana, that's 3/4 of an ounce, is a felony. So the black folks that are disproportionately arrested in Florida, 4-to-1, 5-to-1 ratio in Florida, that have more than that 21 grams, get those felonies, they can no longer vote for life. Because of felony disenfranchisement in Florida, 1 out of every 5 black people eligible to vote cannot vote. 1 out of 5. Now, if those people would have been eligible to vote in 2000, black people almost always vote Democratic, we'd have had a President Al Gore.
Got it.
So that gives you an idea how marijuana prohibition can affect in a much greater degree than just the guy, whether or not he's sitting in a jail cell. It can have long-lasting ramifications that can lead to a completely different presidential administration.
Yeah, and you know, in the past legislative session here, I mean, the Ban the Box campaign shed light on some of the barriers faced by individuals with criminal records. We're talking about a larger picture focus. But what are the effects, economic, for example, of having a marijuana crime on your record? What are the effects on your livelihood and participation in society beyond the voting issues that we've talked about?
Sure. Well, as Ban the Box has pointed out, for people that don't know, that's where you have to check a box on an application form that says whether or not you've been convicted of a crime. And so these people that are convicted of marijuana crimes face a more difficult time getting a job. It's exacerbated when you talk about blacks and Latinos. In fact, I saw a stat the other day that said that a white man with a criminal record has a better chance of getting a resume callback than a black man with a spotless record.
Right.
So you take a black man and give him a criminal record on top of that, and it's just all that much more difficult to reintegrate people into society. That's that school-to-prison pipeline you talked about, where someone gets their first bust, and then when they get out of prison, they can't find the job, and so they have to go back to the weed dealing or whatever job whatever crime they were doing, and then they end up going back into the system. And it's not just whether or not you're busted for weed. My own personal life, I had a career in information technology. I was a technical trainer and a network analyst, and had been doing that job as a contractor for years because contractors don't get urine screened. This company loved me so much, after 2 years of work, they wanted to hire me on permanently, but to work for them permanently, I had to take a drug test. And I said, well, I could probably pass a drug test. I can go without smoking pot for a month and it'll be fine. Well, it wasn't a urine screen, it was a hair test. And this is radio, so the listeners can't see that I'm pretty much bald. So I'm thinking, where are you going to get this hair? And they said, oh, we'll find some hair. I ended up going in for the drug test, and what it consisted of is a woman taking a 39-cent single-bladed Bic disposable razor, asking me to take my shirt off, while she shaved my armpit hair and chest hair to collect the samples to determine whether I was smart enough to do the job I'd been doing for the past 2 years to rave reviews. The hair test will detect use for up to 9 months in heavy users, so I failed that test, and that cut my income by about half, going from being in the IT world to being now in activism. So even without ever being busted for marijuana, just the fact that we have workplace drug screens is causing so many cannabis consumers to be underemployed or unemployed. And then that gets used against us by our opponents that say, well, we did this survey of people that smoke pot and they have lower incomes, so obviously they're less productive. Well, no, they're kept out of the better paying jobs because of the P-test that doesn't tell you whether or not they're a good employee.
That's a nice little circular logic there.
And I say, Dr. Martin Luther King once had a dream that his kids would be judged by not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. I don't think he intended them to be judged by the content of their pee.
Fair enough. Folks, I just want to remind you, if you're just tuning into the 5 Quadrants of Portland, I'm speaking today with Russ Belville of Portland Normal about criminal justice and sentencing reform around cannabis in Oregon's past and future. So let's, now that we've, kind of set the stage for how marijuana has affected people in Oregon, let's look at the changes happening in conjunction with Measure 91. Could you start by giving us a rundown of how previous offenses are being downgraded, by which I mean felonies to misdemeanors or misdemeanors done away with altogether?
Okay.
What's changing there?
Well, the law up until July 1st was that the possession of marijuana up to an ounce was a ticket for which you could pay up to $650. Then from an ounce to 4 ounces was a misdemeanor. But that was a fairly recent change in 2013. Before 2013, over an ounce was a felony. We were the only state that went from ticket to felony with no misdemeanor in between. But that got changed in 2013. Over a quarter pound, 4 ounces, was then a Class C felony. The way the law has been changed now is possession of up to an ounce is absolutely legal. There's no punishment whatsoever. Possession of a half pound at home is completely legal. Possession of 16 ounces of concentrates or edibles is legal. Concentrates being like ice water hash and bubble hash and such. Possession of 72 ounces of liquid infused products like sodas and such is legal. And possession of up to an ounce of store-bought extracts, the BHOs and the oils and such, is completely legal. And as far as downgrades go, up to twice those amounts are just a ticket. So you could have up to 2 ounces and just get a ticket. Up to a pound in your house and just get a ticket. Up to 4 times those amounts are a Class B misdemeanor. And over 4 times those amounts are a Class A misdemeanor. So if you have over 4 ounces in public, over 2 pounds in your house, Class A misdemeanor, which means in the state of Oregon right now, there is no amount of marijuana you can possess and get a felony. There's no felony charge for any amount of possession, except if you've got more than 8 plants in your house, and then it's a Class C felony. There also remains felonies for distributing to kids or unlawful manufacture within 1,000 feet of a school. But if you're a responsible adult, there's no amount of marijuana you can possess and get a felony.
My next question, I guess, would be, are there people currently incarcerated that have been eligible for release under Measure 91 related charges, either from having one of their, felonies downgraded or one of the things they did maybe no longer being a crime at all? I just want to get a picture of how many people might be affected by those changes that are currently in prison.
Sure. Measure 91 didn't directly expunge anyone's records or free anybody, but the legislature followed up with some bills that do provide that measure. It doesn't happen automatically. People have to apply for this expungement, but the way that the bill was written is that when the expungement is considered, the crime that you committed in the past must be considered under the sentencing of today. Mm-hmm. So like you say, if someone had a marijuana grow that got charged with a Class C felony back in the day, it may now only be a Class B misdemeanor. And so the time they've already served may have fulfilled that part of the sentence, and they may be eligible for release. People that already served their time and are out and free, but are having that problem with applications, having to check that box and say they committed a crime, can often get that record sealed or expunged in order to no longer have to answer that question and be able to get jobs. So it's happening on a case-by-case basis. Some of this has to do with the certain types of crimes that they're considering at first. They want to make sure they're not letting people that did other bad things get off the hook for that. If someone was violent in their marijuana trade, that's a whole other consideration. I don't have a firm number on how many this will affect, but it's got to be thousands of people in the state of Oregon alone. And if anyone's interested in getting this expunged, I'd encourage you to check out the law420.com. The law office of John Lucy is working really hard on that.
Right. One thing, and I'm glad you mentioned people being able to have their records sealed. One particular area of interest to me is some felonies that are being reduced to lesser felonies, even, lesser felonies in the future. That changes whether they're eligible to have those records set aside after, I think, 3 years. What can you tell us about the changes there?
I don't have the exact information, but I do know that things like Class A felonies could never be expunged. Class B, you had to wait until 10 years after. Class C, you had to wait until 5 years after. And I might not be accurate on those numbers, but it was something like that. The lower the felony, the lower the charge, the less time you had to wait to get this adjudicated. So that's going to be very helpful for a lot of people.
Got it. So I'm curious also, that reminds me, I'm curious also about how Measure 91 will affect minors. The drug is still prohibited for those under 21. I think a recent story out of Washington involving a rural court sentencing 2 minors to felony for possession caught a lot of people's attention. What are the rules now around minors and marijuana infractions in Oregon?
To be clear for folks, that Washington case in Atherton County was a case of the prosecutor misreading the law. The charges have been downgraded to misdemeanors, so those folks are in good shape.
Good.
As far as how Measure 91 affects minors, it can't make it any worse. There's a survey that the federal government does called Monitoring the Future, and since 1975 they asked 12th graders, if you wanted to get some marijuana, how easy would it be for you to get some marijuana? And between 81 and 90% of the time, for the past 45 years, 12th graders have said, easy or fairly easy. So what? It's going to get easier when we put it into stores behind locked doors where they check IDs? It can't get any easier. In fact, it's going to get tougher. And the reason why is because the kids have access. The kids have someone at their school that deals weed. They know a guy they can get weed from. They don't know a guy they can get tequila from. Why are there no high school tequila dealers? It's not like high schoolers don't drink tequila. It's because there's no profit in it. It's because it's too difficult to go through all the adults to get the tequila to be able to deal it at the high school. But with weed, the teenager can grow it at home. He can deal it at school. He can make a gross profit on it that makes it worthwhile to do. We've already seen in Colorado that the teenagers are reporting their ease of access has gone down. It's still in the 80%, easy or fairly easy, but it's gone down. And sometimes people are scared, well, I know with alcohol when I was a kid, we'd find some guy at the 7-Eleven and give him $20 to buy a 6-pack, right? Yeah, but you had to get an adult. You had to corrupt an adult at some point. You either had to corrupt a store clerk who could lose a license and get serious criminal charges, or you had to corrupt some civilian to buy it for you. But at some point, an adult was involved in that transaction. With weed, no adult is involved in the transaction. Teenager goes to another teenager and gets his weed. That ends today in Oregon.
Got it. So, we're nearing the end of the hour, but I want to see what changes we can expect to see at Oregon prisons or other criminal justice resources in Oregon. You hear a lot about how nonviolent drug crimes plug up resources. What changes can we expect to see now that many things are no longer crimes? I
think from the law enforcement perspective, one thing, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report just came out this week, and it showed that marijuana arrests nationwide for possession went up by 10,000. Drug arrests overall went up by 60,000. So it seems like as we legalize marijuana, states that don't have legal marijuana are ramping up their enforcement. And nationwide, there's a shift more towards synthetics and other non-narcotic drugs. So the amount of work that drug cops will have to do doesn't seem to have gone down. They seem to have shifted it to the harder drugs, which I think many people would say is probably a good thing. Another thing that law enforcement is going to have to deal with is a reduction in their budgets. Many of these law enforcement organizations in the state of Oregon, I think it was $1.7 billion in the last report that they had received through asset forfeitures, through seizures. And since so many of those asset forfeitures are predicated on that initial smell of marijuana, I think the amount that they haul in from seizures is going to down, and they're going to have to find new ways of getting some budget money.
Right. So we're not just talking about, federal funding or whatever grants or something like that.
Well, there's a play on that too. The state of Oregon gets $750,000 from the federal government to fly helicopters into the forests and chop down marijuana plants. Washington Post reported that cost us $60 per plant for what they eradicated. There's a bill in the federal Congress now to eliminate that program, and there's yet more money they're going to have to make up.
Got it. So just in the last couple of minutes, I want to just, with sitting here with you as a marijuana law reform advocate, are there further reforms that you think are necessary or that should be pushed for, either with marijuana or when looking at, sentencing reform for other narcotics?
Yeah, there are many reforms that are still critical. I like to say that we've gotten our Emancipation Proclamation, but we're currently living in the middle of our Jim Crow. And that is, we're legal technically, but we're still societally frowned on. Employers still retain the legal right to fire us merely for who we are, because we have metabolites in our urine. Child custody cases can be decided based on your legal marijuana use. You can lose your kids. Organ transplants, while they've been protected for medical marijuana patients, recreational consumers can still lose their spot on an organ transplant list for their use of marijuana. Second Amendment rights. The federal gun control laws say you cannot sell or give marijuana or ammunition to a known Schedule I drug abuser. That's marijuana. So technically, we don't have our Second Amendment rights. There's so many areas. I think that employment one is the major focus right now, because there's no reason someone should lose their job for their weekend smoking of a joint any more than they should lose their job for their weekend drinking of a beer.
Got it. Well, Russ, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, especially on what I'm sure is a busy day in the marijuana reform field. Again, I've been speaking with Russ Belville, who is the executive director of the Portland chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or NORML. Russ, thanks so much for coming by the studio today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that about wraps up our episode of the Five Quadrants of Portland today. I also want to thank my previous guest, Dennis Thorold from the Oregonian. I want to thank my production team, Danny Jenks and Ryan Sproyer. And most of all, I want to thank you fine folks for listening. Coming up next is Backstory on XRAY-FM, where radio is yours.
All right. Thank you. That was a great interview.
Yeah. I